Great. Well, thank you, Loyd, for joining me today.
Sure.
Making this time. I'm very excited, actually. So what I'd like to do normally is I'll introduce my guests on my show, but usually, especially if they're not that used to doing interviews, but you, sir, are like a pro. In fact,
yeah, I guess.
not
Yeah.
to date you, but I was probably 7 when I first saw you on Unsolved Mysteries. I used to watch that with my mom, and then Sightings, and you name it, just all the ghostly kind of paranormal investigative shows. And and in most recent years, you actually sat with Whoopi Goldberg and Barbara Walters on The View, I saw, which was
Right.
really funny for me to watch as someone who's done media myself, because you're just like, you were in the middle of like cluck, 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 back and forth, and you're trying to answer, and I saw you got out of breath at one point even.
Yeah, I did have to take a breath at one point. They did provide me with a list of all the questions and who would be asking them. What I learned about The View is there's a limited amount of time for the interview, and they all want to get in their questions regardless of what the answers are. So,
Oh yeah, exactly.
yeah, it was a lot.
Well, and questions that are like, what's the meaning of the universe? Like you can answer that in 2-second sound bit, right?
Right,
So
right.
that's why I love these kinds of long form talk podcasts, and I think they're really taking off because there are just things that, as it turns out, the audience isn't so stupid, and people do
Yeah.
like to listen and learn, and so that's why I'm so thankful. So what I thought we'd do today is I want you to just sort of tell my audience who the heck you are instead of me, and just introduce yourself to some degree. What do you do? Where are you from? And what's your mission?
Okay, that's a lot.
And you have 2 seconds, just like The View.
Right. So I'm Loyd Auerbach. I'm a parapsychologist and also a psychic entertainer, professional mentalist as well. I have a master's degree in parapsychology, which I got from a now defunct program at John F. Kennedy University. It was in existence for about 10, 11 years back in the 70s and 80s. I am on the faculty still of JFK, although we don't teach parapsychology there anymore. I'm also teaching parapsychology online through Atlantic University and also through the Rhine Research Center, which is the nation's oldest research organization, where I'm also on the board of directors.
Right.
I am the author of 9 books in the paranormal and 1 that is not. And I've been a consulting editor for Fate magazine. I have been a professional speaker for a long time. I consider myself primarily an educator when it comes to the field of parapsychology, but I am known to be kind of a ghost guy, kind of an investigator.
Right, of ghost-like hauntings. Now, I've tried to get Dean Radin to talk about a few of the things that you and I would like to cover with you today, namely skepticism and
Okay.
the exploration of the paranormal. I shouldn't speak for him, but he didn't seem to want to touch that. He's like, and fair enough, a lot of people who are professionals and researchers don't want to waste their time arguing with people who are unqualified, right? I mean, it's like the rule of debate
Yeah.
is that your opponent has to be qualified to debate you on the topic, and a lot of these skeptics haven't really explored or done any of the research or familiarized themselves with the literature or the studies that have been published and replicated. So it's like, okay, but yet I still think there not only is there room, but it's important that we confront the cynics and the naysayers, because they're quite loud, and it's like, yeah, and it's like, well, someone has to stand up to it, and yeah, there are fakes and charlatans. So I guess first, just for people, let's say, who are totally laymen, like you say you're a parapsychologist and you teach parapsychology. What does that entail? Like, what the heck do you do?
So parapsychology is the study of pretty much all psychic phenomena. That includes extrasensory perception, mind over matter, what we call psychokinesis, and kind of the spiritual side, where we're talking about the concept of consciousness surviving the death of the body. We simply call that survival. That would include things like apparitions and reincarnation cases, sort of near-death experiences, which kind of bridge between a couple of other experiences, and a few others. So we, in the laboratory, can study a lot of that. We cannot study in the laboratory, for example, apparitions, because we have not gotten a ghost to volunteer
Yet.
to show up on time, and that's kind of a tough thing.
Yeah.
So that's field work. Reincarnation, you don't study that in the laboratory. You study that through investigative process as well. But we do study other psychic phenomena, and with the exception possibly of reincarnation, all forms of psi, of ESP, are involved in the spiritual side as well. I mean, if a medium is communicating with the spirit, that's telepathy. So it's all kind of comes together. So what I teach is from a generalist perspective, because I am a generalist. I don't, in the laboratory work that I've done minimal laboratory work other than consulting as a magician and mentalist to help with controls. But I'm very well aware of all the laboratory research. So I teach people about the history of the field, which started in the 1800s. Some people seem to think it started with TV shows in the 90s. I teach the research methods and the findings, kind of where we are today, talk about the evidence that we've got both in the laboratory but also outside the laboratory based on people's experiences. Because so much of what we deal with, including the idea of laboratory research, comes from people's actual experiences that we deal with. So we have the lab work, we have the field work, and I teach courses in various aspects of what parapsychology covers for that.
And I assume that as part of all of this, methodology is a big one that you teach. Like you're teaching scientific people and scientists themselves, how can you study psychic ability? Because it's like, I think of one of my heroes, Jane Goodall. She didn't go into the jungle with the chimps and tell them how to perform and have her conditions implied upon them. She had to explore, and the paranormal, I liken it to that, because it's like, it's a field, and you can't expect it to conform to you. You've got to go into the field, like you said, field research.
Right. We can do an awful lot with ESP in the laboratory. The problem being that we're dealing with human performance. I think this is something that's totally lost amongst a lot of the skeptics. And actually, they don't care. This is the thing that they don't care about. And that is that parapsychology is a social science because we're dealing with human experience and behavior. Right? We are dealing to some extent with what the physics behind some of these things.
Right.
But the phenomena itself is an experiential piece. So we're dealing with human performance. And there's almost no area of human performance where someone can replicate an activity 100% of the time, unless maybe they got OCD or something like that. And it's a simple type of thing for them to do.
Right.
So you don't expect athletes. I mean, nobody expects a baseball player to bat 1,000.
Right.
And batting 500 is amazing. I mean, hitting home runs a certain number of times. No one expects an athlete to produce the same kind of results every time because conditions are always different. Every game that somebody plays is different. An artist, you don't expect an artist to replicate or create a masterpiece every single time because creativity is a human experience and there's a flow involved. So we cannot bring all experience into the laboratory, nor can we really kind of coax it out in any sort of reliable way, but we do have a lot of replication of our experiments and our results. We have people who can do things a lot of the time, maybe not all the time. And I think that's a key element right there. Some things, like I mentioned, cannot be brought into the laboratory. But we are doing a lot of work right now with mediums and looking into, among other things, what's going on in their heads. We can do brain studies while the phenomena is happening, while you're communicating with spirits and when you're not communicating with spirits. A couple of studies been done with mediums who can do psychic readings, mediumistic readings, and just talk to people. And there are 3 different brain states. There's 3 different kinds of activity going on in the brain with those 3 different things, which is pretty damned amazing.
Right. And it's unusual activity that shouldn't be happening under normal circumstances. Like I've read some of the brain scan reports where the frontal lobes go more quiet than they should for a person who's awake and talking.
Exactly.
And I said, well, that seals the deal. I'm a deadhead, basically, when I channel. It's like, and that's what it feels like. It's like I'm getting myself out of the way and the spirit is putting some other reel of film in my head.
And what it boils down to when we talk to these skeptics, the cynics, really, is even pointing at that, very clearly, you're not faking. I mean, people can't consciously turn their brains on and off like that. And if they could, that's worthy of study in itself. And really what it boils, so what we're talking about here is, okay, if it's not spirits, if it's not psychic, what the hell is it and why aren't you studying it?
Yeah.
because clearly people have these experiences, and mass hallucination does not account for ghost sightings.
Right, right. Well, okay, so going back to something you said about replicability, where you can't expect people to perform to the same degree, but like we have mathematicians and they're human and they
Yeah.
to some degree will perform, but what struck me was, well, how does a mathematician get around their mistakes? Well, they have peers who review their work and also go over the same equations, and when you get enough mathematicians, so I think if we extend that analogy, maybe one of the great ways to test mediums is through cross correspondence, where you're having more than one medium on the same case. And I work.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's definitely a good concept here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, great. I'm glad you approve, because that just came to me and I thought, oh yeah, that. Well, I do that in my work here in Canada when I have a client who's a particularly difficult case, or like I just yesterday had a girl who it's an unsolved case, possible murder, and I have my colleagues Deborah Hooper and other mediums that I trust who all send the same client to, so that we'll see if the information lines up without consulting each other in the background, obviously.
Yeah,
So,
one of the things I do that I didn't mention is I'm president of the Forever Family Foundation, which is a foundation that works with spirit mediums, especially in support of their work with grieving families, but also supporting research in life after death. And we actually have a medium advisory board. And at our annual meetings, we have members of our medium advisory board who contact our auxiliary board. So we have the actual board of directors. We have a scientific advisory board and another advisory board. We actually have an auxiliary board, and our auxiliary board is made up of spirits of family members of the board members who have agreed through mediums to be on this auxiliary board. And so we'd have 3 mediums sitting down and contact the auxiliary board to get direction from them for the next year, for what the foundation should do.
wow.
And what's always interesting to me, and the ones that I sat in, I had this one session. This was 2 years ago, maybe it was 3 years ago. My late colleague and friend, Annette Martin, who was a medium and psychic that I worked with extensively, not on the auxiliary board, mind you, pushed through, apparently, because she had something to say.
Wow.
One of the mediums recognized who she was, and I watched as these 3 mediums were like beginning, middle, and end of a sentence. It was almost like Annette was going through all 3 at the same time, but just kind of in a sweep. So we had, while granted they were sitting next to each other, we had that cross correspondence going on at that point.
That's phenomenal. And I'm familiar with the Forever Family Foundation. My ignorance was I didn't know you were the freaking president. That's so cool.
Yeah.
I followed it for
the last
years. Yeah, because I of course, Gary Schwartz, Dr. Schwartz was who got me aware of the
He was involved at the beginning of that, yeah.
Yeah. So, okay. So this is so great. So much information. I want to start to tilt the conversation over to James Randi, the famous anti-psychic skeptic. Now, first of all, just to prove that we know who we're talking about here, I want to give him his just due, because there is something he did that I find very admirable. Back in, I think it was still the 80s, might have even been late 70s. Televangelism was a big thing.
It was the 80s, yeah.
It was the 80s. And so there was this televangelist, and what this guy would do was rob old, desperate people of their entire life savings, because they'd go to his conferences, and at the door when they got their ticket, they'd give their name and maybe their ailment, what they want prayer for, because the scam was that they had people at the front doors going, we're a prayer group, we'll pray for you, anything, and they'll give all that information. And the people would go into the conference, and the televangelist, I can't remember his name offhand.
Peter Popoff.
Peter Popoff, right. So he would stand on stage and pop off all these names and illnesses like he was psychic and getting it from God. And James Randi and his crew went in with a police scanner and picked up radio channel that he had. Popoff had an earpiece. And so, Randi, really great work. I mean, that was bravo. Hats off to you. Amazing.
Yeah, he did that in a few instances, not just with Popoff. And I actually know the guys. The guy who, he also had one of his crew was a local guy here in the Bay Area who would dress up and disguise himself and just show up at all of Popoff. He like one after the other, and Popoff never recognized him. Gave different names. Even dressed up as a woman a few times. and people called him the most healed man in America.
Wonderful. Yeah, so that's great.
So yeah, there are things that I have to say that the the skeptics do that are good, and that's one of them. Sadly, the organized skeptics also have taken a hard line against any form of alternative medicine, which is creating its own problems.
Right.
That's well beyond it. They kind of lump it all into the same bowl, and that's not right.
Well, yeah. Okay. So, James Randi and I actually have a few things in common. More things than not. We both grew up in Toronto, Canada. We both flunked out of high school, and we both lost our hair young. And
me too.
We're both gay. Okay. And I think I have the same taste. His husband's quite an attractive young, I think, South American boy or something. So we have similar taste in men, but that's about it. We diverged from that point on. He became a professional magician, and so he specializes in deception, right? And you're a mentalist, right? You do magic tricks, so it's all about sleight of hand and deception. And I think Randy's flaw is that he sees deception in everything. It's like he's projecting psychologically, like it's like, because he fools people using psychic type of gimmickry, which I think at one point he even believed he was psychic for 5 seconds. He assumes every psychic is the same. And I think that's his mistake. I've done a lot of thinking about this, and that's the core of his error, I think. And it makes him blind to any kind of results. And then his ilk, like Michael Shermer, and Shermer's actually more open. He did a piece.
Yeah, he is more open.
Yeah, he is more open. I've tried to email him several times, but he hasn't got back to me. But and that's the other thing. I've tried to talk to these skeptics. I actually had some email exchanges with James Randi when I was a teenage boy, and he told me to F off.
Yeah,
so
that's right.
It was really funny. Yeah, so okay, so he comes in with this bias, and so he's a naysayer, a skeptic, and everything psychic is not possible. And people listen to him. This is a man who has no degree. He's not a scientist, first of all. And yet he presents himself to the public like he's an authority on this subject. And this brings me to the next point, and then I want to hand the mic to you after. But I even watched Neil deGrasse Tyson, a brilliant astrophysicist and a fantastic, performer, essentially, and raising awareness on science. He was asked a question about psychic phenomena in the afterlife, and his answer was one of these tepid, like, oh, if dead people are really there, you should ask them why they have clothes, and like, but the impetus that people have is like, he's a scientist, so he must know. And I think one of the big misnomers is that just because you're a scientist doesn't mean you're specialized in every field.
Right.
I think, and Jessica Utz, a great scientist, statistician, one of the best in your country, she recently said, what we need now, we already have evidence of the paranormal. I mean, she reviewed almost all of the CIA stuff, right, with remote viewers. She's like, now we need multidisciplines. We need scientists from different fields, engineers, physicists, doctors. We need all of them to team up and bring that into the lab and look at this from every angle. I thought that was brilliant. But then we've got these naysayers who don't have any specialty. I mean, James Randi dropped out of high school. Let alone, like, why does he have an authority on anything? So what do you say to that? And does that spawn any ideas for you?
Well, I've known Randi on and off since the early 80s when I first met him, and didn't have the best introduction to him because he thought I was coming to a parapsychology convention as a magician. And because he saw, I purposely wore a little member badge of the Society of American Magicians, and he made some really derogatory remarks about the people in the room.
Yeah, maybe the spirits are sympathetic to Randi, like you're saying.
Yeah, I kind of doubt that.
Yeah.
Unless it's the spirit of a dead skeptic.
Right.
Although, I have this old Weekly World News issue that's got an article about, it's really pretty much Randi, but it's got somebody else's name, basically saying it's this ghost of this old magician who died, who's apologizing for all the things he said nastily about ghosts. And he spent the first week after death trying to debunk himself. It's a very funny article.
That's good. I got to read that. I've been loving the articles you send, by the way.
I'll have to photocopy that or scan that for you.
Okay, great. So before we got cut off, we were moving into your experience with Randi, and you were making some great commentary. So if you want to pick that up.
You want to start? We need to start from
meeting. You've known Randi, and he sort of mouthed off to you at a conference.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
So So I met James Randi for the first time at the first parapsychology. It was a Parapsychological Association convention I went to in 1981, and he was there attending. He was going to comment on one of the presentations that was being given, and I was wearing my Society of American Magicians pin that was suggested to me by a skeptic friend of mine who was also a magician. Just I should wear that when I meet Randi because he knew Randi and. So Randi noticed I was wearing the pin, and I said, yeah, I'm a member of the Society of American Magicians. I'm relatively new to magic. And then he made some really nasty comment about the researchers that were at the meeting, about parapsychologists. And I basically responded, well, I'm really sorry to hear that. You think that because I just got my master's in parapsychology going into the field.
Right.
And he walked away.
Right.
So that was not a great start. I then was on a panel with him 2 years later at another convention that Marcello Truzzi actually put together, which involved a number of mentalists, some of the folks who founded the Psychic Entertainers Association. And this was about, it was actually a reaction to Randi's Project Alpha, which was a bit of subterfuge. He sent a couple of young guys into a lab pretending to be psychic metal benders like Geller. And after a few years, they barely had a chance to work with these guys. But then Randi blew this as a big, I fooled the scientists, we fooled the scientists. The fact is that the scientists never actually published anything claiming these guys were psychic.
Right.
And the fact is that the more controls the researchers put on these two guys, the less they were able to do, to the point where they couldn't do anything under the final controls. Right. Which is when blew the thing. So he blew that out of proportion. So we had this panel to really deal with the aftermath of this. Right. And the fact that there were mentalists and magicians who were very happy to work with parapsychologists and were not opposed to the idea of psychic phenomena. In fact, all the mentalists on the panel said, that they supported parapsychology. One of them, actually two of them, said that they had their own psychic experiences. Randi was not happy about what was being said on the panel, I have to say. And he didn't probably walk away very happy about any of what happened, given the fact that he was shouted down a number of times and told that how unethical his little experiment, his project was by these other magicians.
Really?
So, yeah. So, he made his mark on the field in a very negative way. The lab actually ended up closing because of Project Alpha and the misrepresentation. Right. Wow. So. Okay. Oh, and I've had encounters with him over the years since then, and a couple of them have been okay. Some of them, sometimes it was being on TV with him. I have never shied away from dealing with the skeptics because I have maybe not as much knowledge as Randi, but I'm a hell of a better performer than he ever has been. Right. Although I can't do escapes. I never could do escapes. Right. Never tried. Never even tried.
That's right. Yeah, you were saying that he wasn't known amongst magicians as one of the best either when he was doing that. So it's almost like he was riding the coattails. He found his niche, which was to expose frauds, and I think he became somewhat of a whistleblower on frauds, which exist. I mean, there are fraudulent people out there.
No question, but I think part of it was he was inspired to some extent by Houdini's later activities in life. Mm-hmm. Because, much of Houdini's activities after his mother died were directed at exposing fraudulent spirit mediums, partly because he got so mad that mediums were trying to fake him out with contact with his mother.
Right. Now, I'm not sure if you know anything about this, but Houdini had a code that he said if life after death is real, I'll give it through a medium. Yeah. And I think I read something years ago that his wife actually got the code eventually. It was given through a medium.
She got it from Arthur Ford, but apparently there's some evidence to indicate that Ford may have accidentally been exposed to the code, code word.
I see.
It's not clear whether that's the case. But magicians still to this day do a Houdini seance on October 31st to try to contact Houdini. It's a publicity stunt. That's the anniversary of his death. As it happens, it's Halloween. Right. And the statement from skeptics, often skeptical magicians as well, if anybody could come back, it's Houdini. And the fact is that that's not true. Mm-hmm. We don't know the rules. And of course, I have to make light of it because for at least the last couple of decades, if not longer than that, there's more than one seance. In fact, there was an official Houdini seance that Bess Houdini did for 10 years on the anniversary of his death. I have a recording of the last one that she did officially. Then she handed over the reins and the rights to a man named Walter Gibson to do them. Gibson being an incredibly knowledgeable magician, also the creator of The Shadow, the radio character.
Wow.
And also, as it happens, a believer in psi, in ESP. He'd had his own experiences. I got a chance to talk to him back in the 80s as well. He's actually written books on psychic phenomena. Wow. So
okay.
he was like me, skeptical of individual events, but not skeptical of the phenomena.
Right.
Other people took up on that Houdini challenge, and the thing I like to kiddingly say is, look, you got 15 Houdini seances going on around the world on October 31st, many of which are at the same time. How does he decide which one to go to?
Right.
You
Well,
know,
and like you said too, the rules, right? So you know,
Yeah.
like I'm reminded there was a friend of mine, very good friend of mine, who won the lottery. He won 26 million at 21 years old. He was one of the youngest Powerball winners, and he had won because of a premonition. He had a dream that was so realistic that he played the lottery, and it was a quick pick too. It was just random Powerball. That night, that week, he had won every hand at poker, and he was drunk, saying to his friends, "I got the winning ticket. I got the winning ticket." Of course, it all came true. So he does paranormal films. His name's Tim Schultz, and he did a film called Chasing the Shadows. And one of his dear friends, who was working on the film with him, decided to commit suicide during the film, during the production. And I channeled her spirit, and of course, she had depression and other issues. But I heard from her that her intent was to provide undeniable evidence of life after death. She was going to commit suicide, come back on the camera, and like do something big. And it wasn't so simple. It wasn't so easy. She discovered, and it was like, wow, what a waste of what terrible situation. And so it's like people have to realize spirit phenomena and paranormal phenomena, like we're talking about, it's not something that's easy or easily demonstrable. And to some degree, I think we have to treat it like a field and go to where the phenomena is and respect it, you know? And
right.
I think one of the best cases that Randi had, because he had his $1 million challenge to any psychic or paranormal person who thought they could prove under controlled circumstances. Natasha Damkina. Have you heard of this young Russian girl? I think she did phenomenally, and they actually statistically scored her accuracy. So she came from Russia with her mother to take the Randi challenge, and she was a medical intuitive. She was, I think, 12 at the time, maybe 14. And she was doing, she was able to see into people's past injuries, health ailments, and scan their bodies psychically. And Randi had it set up that, and one of the agreements that she had, because you can make up your rules with Randi, she wanted her mother with her. And last minute, they changed the time. She was still jet lagged, so they had her perform when she was jet lagged. They took her mother away. She was crying. She was visibly upset. So they're testing this psychic child under these terrible conditions. They've changed the agreement halfway through. And even still, I think she got something like 4 out of 10 or something correct, which statistically was very valid, even though it doesn't seem on a carnival style. That's the other thing. Right. You know, and so maybe you want to speak to any of that, like his methodologies.
Yeah, you know, I dealt with Randi's challenge in several articles in Fate and other places, and as well as other types of media. When you read the challenge, you know, there was the agreement you have, that the application you fill out, what you're agreeing to, and there's the actual rules of the challenge. In many respects, it was the application and agreement to what you are agreeing to in order to do this that created more. I said, you know, I advise people not to go for the challenge mainly because of that. Forget about the rules of the challenge. I mean, people in my field were concerned that there really wasn't $1 million. Yes, that was verified finally. That money was in escrow. I know Stanley Krippner, one of my colleagues, was involved in some of the testing. Julian Isaacs was involved in some of the testing, another one of my colleagues. Julian may have, I think was involved in that one case you mentioned with Natalia, because he was severely critical of Randi and his people not allowing this person to rest. And that was a common thing, to push someone, you know, we'll tweak it until we're all satisfied the controls are right. Oh, and by the way, now that it's been, you know, you had to do it 30 times till we get everything right, you don't have any time to rest. You have to do it again right now, and you have to do it under those conditions. So that in itself as an end result is not right. The challenge rules themselves included little bits like the fact that if you won, first of all, you're signing away any right to sue no matter what Randi says. So essentially, yes, you'll get $1 million. But Randi and his people could say you cheated. They could pretty much libel, defame you as much as they wanted to make you out as a con artist, and you couldn't say anything about that. Second thing is they owned the results. Third thing was, if you failed, you would never make those claims again. You would agree you'd never make those claims again.
And if you
so
did,
basically,
they could sue
it's like, or that's right. So essentially,
right.
You are screwed if you win. You have $1 million. You're screwed otherwise if you win. Your reputation is going to be smeared anyway. Although I contended to one psychic that I said, the fact is, though, that if he claims you conned him, you can make a big deal about that and shut him up, because clearly if somebody could con him, his challenge is not worth anything, nor is he. They could have really shut him up, but they wouldn't have been able to claim they were a psychic because Randi owned the rights to all of that. So I actually showed, my dad was a sports producer for NBC and on his own afterwards, and I showed the application to a number of folks in the sports world, including also a couple of entertainment lawyers. And I wanted to say, I said, look, would you do this as an athlete? If this was a challenge for athletic performance based on how well you've done in the past, would you do this? I said, and then the entertainment attorneys, same thing. And they all said, no way. I would never let our clients do it. We'd never do it because you're signing away everything on the chance. It's like playing the lottery. You might win the $1 million, but you have a lot more to lose than $1 or $2 to play at this. So there was that. The other side of it is that one of the rules on the challenge was that technically you had to be tested by someone locally. Now, sometimes they let that bypass. If somebody like Natalia coming from Russia or from someplace else, they would skip that. But a lot of times you had to go through a local group first, and those people were not necessarily at all capable of doing a decent test, and they were just as dogmatic, if not more so, and more rabid than Randi's people. And it wasn't going to be a fair test, and they didn't have to have a fair test for the local thing. So a lot of folks could have tried and never gotten past that point, and Randi always had the opportunity to say, well, you didn't pass the local thing, I don't want to challenge, want to test you.
Not worth my time, right? And
he actually turned people down too. The late Martin Caidin, who I worked with, he was a science and science fiction writer. Actually, the creator of the $6 Million Man. His book Cyborg became that. He was a technical advisor on the series. He was a consultant to NASA. This was the guy who was not a lightweight. He also could do psychokinesis. He could move things, and we tested him I worked with him for a few years before he died. Also had an experience with his ghost afterwards. That's a whole different story.
Oh, okay. We got to talk about that after.
But Marty showed me letters, because Marty lived in Florida, Randi lived in Florida. Marty was getting some notoriety even before I met him. And Randi wrote him a letter challenging him to go for, I think at that time, maybe the $10,000 prize. So it was before the $1 million challenge. And Martin Caidin was an incredibly bullheaded, larger-than-life character who wrote him back a letter saying, fine, I'll take the challenge, and I'll tell you what. If I can't do it, I'll pay you $10,000.
Ooh, money where the mouth is. Good.
Right. Randi wrote back and backed off. We assume it was because he made some comment about, well, if you're that sure of yourself, you must have a way to cheat.
Okay, right.
So he there were people that wanted to go for the challenge and even put up money or put up against Randi, and he just wouldn't accept them. So there was that piece of it as well. The challenge ended a few years ago. I was on Larry King back maybe a little more than 10 years ago, and it was actually I've got a little bit of that up on my YouTube channel, but it was a show that was stocked for Halloween. It was stocked with way too many people. Yep. Michael Shermer was on it in L.A. Linda Blair was on it. They had all these people who had experiences, and Randi made some comment to a couple who I had done a segment with on Unsolved Mysteries. From up in Vancouver, Washington. And at one point, Randi said, "Well, you ought to have your haunted house go up from my $1 million challenge." And I made the comment immediately, well, your challenge doesn't apply to a haunted house.
Right.
At which point they cut off everybody's mic except when Larry wanted to talk to somebody.
Right, right.
So
This,
that was not it was not uncommon for Randi to make those kinds of comments and claims.
right, right. Which just obfuscates the phenomena, and it's sort of to
Right.
the layman who doesn't understand science. This is why I do this podcast and why I do my television show, which I'd like to have you on as well, by the way. But I'm trying to educate people. Like my show consists of half a interview like this, and then we show a reading that I've done on somebody.
Yep.
And we don't edit the readings. The only reading that we edited was the second one, which was an unsolved murder case, because we essentially wanted to protect the victim's family and my staff, because
Sure.
the murder's still out there. So we can't let on that I know as much as I do, because we know murderers watch wholesome cable television. That's my luck. So these television shows like Larry King, which I was always enjoying, I only watched Larry King when you guys came on, when they had a paranormal topic, and it was actually kind of good. I think their ratings skyrocketed whenever they had a paranormal topic. It's almost like, even if you're a non-believer, it's just fascinating, right?
Yeah. I was going to say, sadly, he also had Sylvia Brown on a lot, and she was having a phony or pushing up that person was really bad for everybody else.
It really was. And so, okay, so what these shows will do, and Regina Scott Meredith, creator of the Conscious Media Network, and now she works on Gaia TV, and she's a fantastic journalist, and her husband, I love them to death. They were such supports to me when I was a teenager. She brought the point that these shows try to create a what look like balance by having an expert like yourself on the panel and then someone like James Randi. And that's not real balance, because it infers that you're not balanced. It's like, no, Loyd Auerbach is someone who is a skeptic and an expert and studied this. And maybe you need to have a panel with you and Dr. Schwartz and Julie Bichel and all the other wonderful experts out there, because you guys are skeptics. And this is this false narrative that you're not because you find evidence. Like that somehow disqualifies you from the skeptic camp.
Right.
And it's like, no. Nowhere else do they do that except with the paranormal, it seems. I think, climate
and politics.
Yeah, politics too.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So getting back to the challenge, the Randi challenge, we know that it's no longer available. And yet I still get emails. Like I was talking to Dave Packman, who has a YouTube show. He's pretty successful. He's a pundit. He's a political pundit. And he's been dabbling in psychic commentary. And I emailed him and challenged him. I said, because he's definitely against it. And he's like, well, then why haven't you won the Randi challenge? And because it's not there anymore. There's no Randi challenge. And all the stuff we've just talked about, that it's not a valid challenge. So do you have anything to speak to that? And have you heard of any other challenges similar out there?
There are skeptic groups, local groups, that still have like a $5,000 or $10,000 challenge. They don't make a big deal about it. It really depends on how publicity oriented they are in their own community, for example.
Right.
And very recently I was actually spoke with Ed May, who ran the U.S. Stargate program, the psychic spying program, and one of my other colleagues, Pam Heath. We were on a panel at the World Science Fiction Convention, which was here in the Bay Area this year. We had a panel on parapsychology, and we had a packed room. It was great. And I knew that we were going to pack room because science fiction fans have an interest in this subject, but there's a lot of people who do have a skepticism about it.
Right.
A lot of the skeptics actually in the audience came up to us afterwards, admitted to their skepticism, and said that they were going to start looking into some of this stuff because we made a lot of valid points. Right. So they were true skeptics. They were doubters, not disbelievers. One guy, however, brought up the Randi challenge. How come nobody's going for the Randi challenge? Nobody won the Randi challenge. And I basically said, beside the fact that it's not being offered, and the guy's like, what do you mean it's not being offered? I said, check his website. It hasn't been offered for years. This guy was incredibly uninformed about this. Mm-hmm. I flat out asked, this is something, I wrote an article, I sent you this article. I wrote an article for Fate magazine years ago, which I called So What? Mm-hmm. And really, it came out of a conversation I had with someone at a college where I was lecturing. And it was the same thing with this guy. If someone won the $1 million challenge, is what I said to this man at the World Science Fiction Convention, would you suddenly, beat Randi's challenge? Randi gives him $1 million for doing something psychic. Would you suddenly be open to psychic phenomena and the evidence for it? Would you accept that this was real? And the guy said, well, no, it has to be replicated. I said, exactly. We have replication in our field. You heard us talking about that. Granted, it's not for $1 million, but what's the point? It's a publicity stunt.
Yeah.
And that's all it was. It was and is still to this day a publicity stunt.
And it targets the layman, the people who don't understand the scientific method, and they look at Randi and say, well, this is someone who must know his stuff because he's a magician. He's trained to present himself in something he's not.
Right. I have to say it also targets scientists.
Yeah.
It targets other magicians as well. I mean, it targets anybody who has, and I will say it's dogma here. They have the dogma, they have the faith. Because I look at this as skepticism as a continuum, skepticism and belief. On one end, we have true believers. And these are people, these people. These are people who believe almost anything somebody tells them.
Yeah.
From a new age, metaphysical, spiritual, folklore perspective. And there are those people that believe everything.
I call them the airy fairies.
Yes, that's right. That's
airy
right.
Fairies, woo-woos, yeah.
At the other end, there are the true disbelievers whose faith in the non-existence of this is so strong that they will not look at the evidence, even if other of their colleagues say that there's something there.
Yeah.
This was very clear back in 2011, I think it was, the Journal Personality Study and Social Behavior Study publication. It was a mainstream science journal from psychology.
Yeah.
They announced their upcoming issue. In the issue was going to be a study on precognition by Daryl Bem, a social psychologist at Cornell University.
Right.
It was a precognition experiment. That's all it said. It didn't say, for example, what his results were, whether he had positive, negative, or neutral results. So when this went out, there was a hue and cry from the mainstream academia, scientific community. How dare this journal publish a parapsychology report? How dare Daryl Bem do this research? How dare, this is an affront to science. It was insane. A few smart reporters, including somebody from the New York Times, started interviewing some really big name scientists to get to hear what they had to say about this. And this one reporter, and I know there were some other reporters who did this as well, asked, after hearing them, really say this was a real affront, this was not science, this was pseudoscience, these scientists were asked, do you know what the results were? Had you read the article? And universally that was a no. And then several of them said, why would I? ESP is impossible, precognition is impossible, so why would I waste my time? Which, fortunately, the reporter then pointed out is about as unscientific as you can possibly be.
Right.
That is an unscientific attitude.
Right. And it's like a dogma, like you said. I listened to a couple of scientists a few years back talk about how it's a taboo almost, the field of paranormal research. It's like you almost lose grants and credibility amongst the scientific community because of what you said. They have a belief that it's not real, and in spite of all the evidence, they just won't look at it. It reminds me of the people's refusal to look through Galileo's telescope.
Yeah.
And
it's. I have to say that there is. This is partly Randi's fault, actually.
Yeah.
Definitely Psychop's fault. That over the years they have been loudmouth. They have been pushing an agenda. Their requests for money to support the Skeptic organization and in the Skeptical Inquirer have been similar to what churches do. So they've been following what religious orders do in terms of getting money and hitting people's fears and all sorts of things. So they've really created a difficult situation in academia, because this really goes across all academia in the United States, not so much in the UK, thankfully, where if an individual admits their interest in the subject, they can be chastised and ostracized. The term woo-woo, which you mentioned, which we might use for the airy fairies, is applied by skeptics for anyone or anything, literally, that they don't want to believe in.
Yeah.
And they've made it very difficult for people. I have a colleague of mine who was an adjunct professor teaching psychology at a university in Florida, and he was fired because of his outside work in parapsychology.
Wow.
And the only reason he didn't sue for wrongful termination, because he had a hell of a case, was because his wife still had a really high-paying job in the administration of the university.
My goodness.
So
My goodness, that's
yeah.
crazy.
So, it's impossible. Dean Radin talks about this. I mean, a lot of us go to conferences or meet scientists who will say, I've actually been in situations where with a group of people, they've been agreeing that ESP doesn't exist and even making fun of it. Then they pull me aside later on and tell me their ghost story.
Right. Right. To protect their reputation,
Right,
essentially.
exactly.
Okay, so the last two things I want to touch on is, well, so what does it mean in terms of the research of this field? Like what can be done to combat and to fight back against the damage of the naysayers? And then I'll ask you the final question after that.
That's a really good question. What's unfortunate is it's not just the naysayers. It is the terrain of how the media covers parapsychology.
Right.
Again, it's that idea that, well, if we're having you on, we have to have a skeptic. So there's that element, but there's also the piece that the media likes to make this look spooky and weird and strange. And the reality is, as you know, there is nothing paranormal about the paranormal. It's normal.
Right.
People, based on just the number of people who believe in it and the number of people who have reported experiences in all the surveys, if you have a third of the people in the world who have had an ESP experience, and it's actually more than that, how is that paranormal? That's normal. It's normal. Rare.
Yeah.
But it's still normal. So they make this weird because it's ratings worthy. It's Halloween is coming up next week. There's all sorts of stories on ghosts and things, making it spooky and weird. I've usually used that as a hook to then turn it around and say, here's what it's really like.
Yeah.
Ghostbusters was Ghostbusters was, at that time period, was one of the best hooks we had to actually talk about the real stuff, because nobody believed that was at all real.
I see your unlicensed nuclear accelerator behind you.
That's right, my portable particle accelerator. Yeah.
The proton.
I also have a PKE valence detector.
That's right. My first day of kindergarten, they still have the picture in the school album, 1980s. I showed up with a proton pack and a trap, so I was ready for school. So okay. So
it's really both sides. It's really the media and it's really the skeptics. So we're combating a lot, and we've talked about this. In fact, we talked about it again at the last Parapsychological Association meeting. Part of it is the word parapsychology.
Yep.
Really. We're trying, we've been trying for years to come up with another name for the field. It's really tough to do that.
Yeah.
It boils down to the fact that we need help from branding people, from advertising people, from publicity people. We're going to have to start doing what the skeptics were doing.
Well, and there's you really do, because there's that joke about scientists. Whenever they come up with an acronym, it's always a ridiculous, embarrassing acronym. They'll come. So they actually have to hire people to brand them, and that's a good point. It does.
Yeah.
And there's so few of us too. It seems like the naysayers are more plentiful and louder.
They are. And I think if you take the practitioners and the genuine practitioners and the parapsychologists and put them in a group, we have a good number of people. But unfortunately, getting practitioners involved with our field has been very, very difficult. I will honestly say that over the last, I've been involved in this field since 1979 directly, and actually before that as a student. Spirit mediums are much more interested in the hows and whys than the average psychic is.
Yeah.
And I personally, I've had conversations with mediums and psychics about this. I think it's because mediums work with people, living and dead. You guys are social. You have to talk to people. Whereas psychics are dealing with information generally and don't have to necessarily do anything more than give information. They don't have a give and take conversation. But if we could somehow mobilize the practitioners as well as the parapsychologists who are willing to be mobilized, if there's a way to do that, we really could do a lot in this case.
I'm going to add an idea as well. I think, like, before we had the academia and before doctors had diplomas, we still had healers in the world. They just didn't have a degree. And I think in the psychic field, it's a pioneering field. And I think we don't have a degree for psychics yet. We don't have a way to regulate them. The Forever Family Foundation is the closest thing I've seen to an organization that actually accredits psychics.
Yeah.
And you have classes and training, and one of the things that was really impressive about your foundation is that you actually train mediums in how to be ethical, which was
I mean,
really
the ethical
big.
thing it's a big part of it. I think it should be a big part of any practitioner of any field. We do this also in parapsychology as well. Yeah.
I think it'll take maybe 150 years, but if I were alive at that time, which I obviously won't be, I think I would be a doctor in my field. I think I'd have a PhD for being psychic, and I think that's going to happen in the future. I think that will lend a lot of credibility as well from the public's point of view. If we can get and it will weed out the charlatans, because anyone can hang a shingle and say they give readings.
Right.
It's illegal to practice medicine without a license.
Yeah, well, the issue though is, in some respects, being psychic is kind of like being a really good artist or musician.
Yeah, that's true.
There can be training involved, but it's coming from inside, and it's coming from it's partly related. It's in fact greatly related to creativity. We have probably the greatest correlation we have is creativity to psychic ability,
which Edgar Cayce predicted.
That's exactly right. So what we need to do really is, you think about what makes a great artist. Different things make a great artist. It's actually, good art because when you see it, it's just different people have different tastes. But true. Music's a little different. We need to push psychic ability in general as something that people can learn to use better. I mean, this is about, this is what J.B. Rhine, who was kind of the father of modern parapsychology, said. It's distributed amongst the population. Some people have an app. Now, this is something that I've learned, and talking to my colleagues, we all kind of feel the same way. People have different aptitudes for different kinds of psychic applications. Mm-hmm. Some people are better mediums or mediums, period. Mm-hmm. Some people can do psychometry. They can read an object, but others cannot do that at all.
Or like Natalia, who was able to see medically into people's
There's
bodies.
Medical intuitives, right, exactly. Barry Taff himself, one of my colleagues, is also medical intuitive besides being a parapsychologist.
I haven't been able to get a hold of Barry. I've tried calling his office. What's wrong with him?
We'll have that conversation offline.
Offline.
He has health issues, but I can get him in touch with you.
I would appreciate that. I've been worried about him. Yeah.
Yeah, well, me too.
Ever since the Ghost Adventures team thing. Right?
Yeah, he's had health issues for the last couple of years.
We'll talk about that later. Okay, great. So, yeah.
Yeah. So basically, I think people seem to think, and this is an interesting, the skeptics thing, too. Mm-hmm. There seems to be this attitude or understanding or belief, I think it's just purely belief, mm-hmm. that if they admitted ESP exists or psychic phenomena exists, suddenly everybody in the world would be psychic and all their secrets would be gone. I actually had somebody pretty much tell me that. And the fact is, you could acknowledge it exists in order to study it, but that's not going to turn everybody's abilities on.
I think it'll do the opposite, frankly.
Yeah. Well, I think it'll bring some people out of the woodwork. On the other hand, we'll get a lot more phonies too. That's people.
Yeah. But like I said too, you didn't get the phenomena of surgeons until after we accredited medicine and started to really hone it, and I think there'll be psychic surgeons, not literally psychic surgery, which we know is like a questionable practice, but
right.
And here's the other point I wanted to make before we move on to the next question, the final question, which was, I don't think every psychic is an intellectual, and I think that, like you say, mediums tend to be better to work with researchers, but I think mediums who are also just happen to be intellectual and have a curiosity about how it works and is able to, like you wrote a great article about the qualities of the best mediums, which essentially mean that, like, it looked like, not to toot my own horn here, but it sounded like you were talking about me. It's like sense of humor, makes fun of yourself, compassionate, willing to change their mind, willing to be wrong, has, a healthy ego, but not a bad ego where they think they're all that and they argue, So I thought that was really cool, and that was so well written. I never quite read something like that before.
Yeah, I don't know that anybody's written that, but what's interesting is when I delivered that paper to, it was a conference on mediumship put on by the Parapsychology Foundation at the University of Virginia, in fact, years ago. And Julie Beischel was in the audience. And when I finished my presentation, Julie stood up and said, "We've been trying to work on a list for a while, me and Gary. Thanks for writing our list for us."
Yeah, perfect. Yeah.
So, and really that article, and, if your listeners want to contact me, I'm happy to send them the full paper at any time too. And I'll send that.
Yeah.
Yeah, but the whole idea of that was my observations of literally working with psychics and mediums in investigations and in other circumstances. And I work with some bad ones. I work with a lot of good ones, and a lot of people who tried,
Right.
tried very hard.
Mm-hmm.
And it really boils down to what makes a good human being. Because I think the qualities that were in that make a good person, not just a good psychic or medium. And these are, and that's aside from the other thing that makes a good psychic or medium is providing useful information. That's another piece of it. That's a really important piece because, I've talked to psychics who were really good at providing information about my past, but couldn't identify what issues were, and I would ask them flat out, well, here's the problem I'm dealing with. Well, I can tell you all about the people and all about that. And it's like, okay, so you're psychic. How does that help me?
Yeah. No, exactly.
If it's not helpful, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter.
I think, and I might be stepping on a limb here, but I'm an intellectual, and I read like Dostoevsky and things like that. Okay, I'm Course in Miracles student. So here's the thing. I think you have to be intellectual and psychic to know how to use it properly. I think there has to be an intellectual component. This is something I haven't worked this out fully in my head, but I've thought a lot about it. And when I was younger, I would do readings and I'd sort of dabble in what you're talking about. I'd have fun seeing into people's characteristics and their past and the people around them. But there came a point when I was about maybe 10 years into the work where I'm like, yeah, but now I need to really focus on giving people tools and strategies to deal with life problems, because the people coming to me had just I'm sure you can imagine because you work in this field, but like people cannot imagine what happens in my office in a day.
Yeah.
Like yesterday, I'm dealing with a mother whose daughter was found in Lake Ontario. You know what I mean? Like it's like horrifying stuff. Yeah. And what really turned it for me was when I devoted myself fully to mediumship, because I was dabbling between psychic readings and mediumship at the same time. And now even when I do a life reading on someone, it's always from a spirit guide. I don't give my opinion. And I can remote view. I can see what's in your closet. I can tell you lots of cool stuff about yourself. That's fun. But I only go to the guides because the spirit guides who have gone through the guide training program, which I've been told is 100 years long. You have to train for 100 years to become a spirit guide. And they have access to temporal information, and they've been trained in ethics. They've got like 10 PhDs in the spirit world. So these guides are very sophisticated entities. And that's all I'll deal with if I'm doing a life reading and nothing else. And clients will even ask me, they'll say, bro, what do you see about my boyfriend? And I'm like, I'm not a spy, and I'm not going to do that. I tell them, you're not asking me anything. This is not a two-way conversation, I say to my clients. I mean, unfortunately, you can't control what I'm going to come up with because I can't even control what I'm going to come up with.
Sure, because you're talking to somebody else.
I'm dealing with spirit guides. So even my life readings have turned into, and I found far more profound when I gave myself fully to spirit. Much more profound information because it's not my own intelligence. I'm working with a team now. And so I just wanted to say that for the record, because maybe that'll help in terms of your research and work with mediums, that maybe there's a caliber and an intellectual type of medium that would be best for this type of research.
What I think is really interesting is that there is, again, amongst the best, there's number one, the common sense does rule, and unfortunately common sense doesn't rule for everybody. And actually, there's some academic programs such as training for a lawyer, a law school, which trains common sense out of you.
Right.
So, yeah. But there is an element of internal critical thinking, thinking about how you're getting the information, what information you're getting, how it's applying to people. And what I really find ironic is the skeptics are always talking about that people need to learn critical thinking. Well, the fact is that the best psychics already have critical thinking. The best parapsychologists already have critical thinking. Critical thinking, the way they're talking about it, is coming up with a different explanation. That's not critical thinking. Critical thinking is examining and asking questions and looking at what the data is critically. I mean, just taking it apart. And I think the best people in this field who practice have done that with themselves.
Right. You have to be an expert in that, to function. I can tell as a psychic, Like, I'm getting data, and I just wrote a small article on this the other day. I called it the world before words, because psychic information has no labels and no attachment. And
Right.
I use the example, like, if I'm sitting with someone who's going through a divorce, is it accurate to say that you're going through a divorce? But what if I see happiness in their love life, and the divorce is actually the best thing they've ever done, and they're quite happy about it? Like, which is more accurate, the word divorce or the experience that they're having?
Sure.
And this is level of complexity that information psychics get is like very complex. And I
Yeah.
think psychics who aren't as good are still getting that information, but they have no filter through which to interpret it because they're lacking the intelligence.
Well,
And
or what they're doing is that they are. This is one of the things that we teach people when they're trying to develop psychic ability. It's actually part of the process of learning remote viewing, is learning not to put labels, not to put categories, not to not to name something, because the information in psychic, as you know, psychically might come through partially, at least at first, or partially, period. And if you take that partial information, that partial image you get, and you name it, suddenly the rest of it fills in.
right, you're filling
And
the
it
blanks.
may fill in from your own experience in a way that has nothing to do with what's actually happening.
Right, exactly. And the best readings I've done is when I throw caution to the wind. I sat with a young lady once and I said, you should be involved in like philanthropic work. Like I just popped out of my mouth. It's like Tara's Charity. And her jaw hit the floor. She's like, I'm doing a blog for Tara's Charity. I've never heard of Tara's Charity before. It's not a famous one. And it's that type of thing. Like, it just pops out. And if I interpreted that too much, I would have gotten in the way. And that's what I used to do when I was younger.
Yep.
I remember, and in the last few years, I've stopped doing it because just expertise, So, final question, and I hope you have the time for this. It's just a simple sort of prediction from you. What do you think is going to be the linchpin, the thing that convinces the world that this stuff is real eventually? What would that look like, do you think?
That's an interesting question. In some respects, some of us have looked at what could be done to the general public to really convince, just as a kind of almost a stunt in some respects. And I have seen, strangely enough, from science fiction, there was a book called The Intervention by someone named Julian May, which is the series by Julian May on which deals with psychic phenomena throughout. Has a lot that May actually apparently came to a parapsychology convention years ago, has been reading up on the field, and had the idea of doing a joint live remote viewing under incredibly strict controls between a Russian group and the U.S. group. And I think what it would take would be impeccable controls in a media forum with some demonstration of psychic ability by multiple people, not just one person.
Right.
But even then, the problem is that as soon as you do it in the media, it's going to be, collusion and all sorts of other things will be brought up.
Right.
But you will actually bring in some more people for that. So I think that's it. But ultimately, it really boils down to getting more funding into the field. Having funding sources or being able to fund the field in a way that allows for researchers to actually do their work. We talked earlier about the fact that academics will hide their interest. If there's a lot of money available for grants, if suddenly somebody had $100 million available for all sorts of grants in parapsychology, I guarantee we would see scientists crawling out of the woodwork, especially ones who don't currently have grants,
right,
to try to do research on the subject.
Right.
The economics of our field, we have one foundation that funds research, which could change its mind next year, and all that money goes away, and it's not even a lot of money. So there's some, like certain universities that have some funding internally, like University of Virginia does have funding. They bring in their own money. The Ryan Research Center has next to no money. They are struggling all the time, barely gets any grants for research. We need funding, and it's going to take funding which would allow for more things to be done in the field, which attracts more people. We can't even attract young people because there's no occupation here.
Yeah, that's it.
There's no way to make money, at least not in the United States. In the UK, there are 20 plus universities that have parapsychology in some form or other. as part of their curriculum, if not a single program.
Right, right. Very good answer. Very good answer. And maybe it's not a single event. Maybe it'll just be like a process and not a product. Because like you said, it can't be turned into an occupation, can't be turned into a pill, you know, so it's immaterial. It's truly immaterial. And if that's the problem with spirit, right?
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to hit stop on our recording now, and that was great. Program kind of